Good morning. I'm actually amazed how many of you are here at 8 a.m. on Friday morning. It's a testament to the character of today's youth. So what we're going to finish up talking about today is fertility in the pre-industrial world. And the important thing is that, as I mentioned last time, it used to be thought that Europe had a great advantage over other pre-industrial societies, and in particular Northwest Europe, in being able to effectively avoid half of potential births. And it turns out that this is done by what in some ways is a relatively peculiar mechanism. Within marriage, there's no evidence of any conscious fertility control in any country in Northwest Europe before about 1780. All right? So for the pre-industrial period, as far as we know, that once people got married, you had as many children as you might happen by natural mechanisms to have. But the society still avoided about half of all potential births by what's called the European marriage pattern. And so this had the characteristics that, and when we're talking about marriage or fertility, what really matters is women. Men are relatively unimportant. It's really, we have to look at the behavior of women in terms of predicting the overall fertility. And so the important thing is that women marry late, typically between ages 24 and 26. In some examples of that pattern, the average age of first marriage for women can get up to 28, right? And that means that the onset of fertility for women can be 10 years before sexual intercourse starts in this society. And so there really is this long delay, and those are the most fertile years for women as well. And so the first important characteristic is that women wait to enter marriages. The second thing is that a substantial number of women and of men, since in Northwestern Europe there's roughly a sex balance, a substantial number of women simply never get married. Okay? And what's actually happening with this marriage pattern is that about half of all fertile women at any time typically are unmarried. If there was sexual activity outside marriage, then we would expect to see reasonable amounts of illegitimacy. But in fact, only something like 3 to 4% of all births are illegitimate in these societies. Now, this pattern is not actually constant over time. There are some periods where the age of marriage moves up, and there's some periods where the age of marriage moves down. And when we come on and talk about the Industrial Revolution in Britain, what we'll actually see is that there's a population explosion in Britain at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and one very important component of that is that the average woman got married 2 years earlier. And so it actually is a very powerful regulator of the fertility in the society, is just what age women on average are getting married. But as I say, it moves up and down between generations, and it varies somewhat across societies. And so it's it's a powerful regulator, and because of that, the total fertility rate, that is the number of births to a woman who lived to age 45 in Northwest Europe, is only 5 on average, right? And the important thing here is that a woman who was married from ages 20 to 45 would typically give birth to 8 or 9 children, right? And so the way that, as I say, most of these births are being avoided are by this later age of marriage and by large numbers of women not marrying. And what's actually interesting about this is that in some ways, this is a very modern behavior for Europeans. It's still the case that women tend to get married relatively late, though marriage has not the same social meaning now, right? And it's also the case that large numbers of women in Western European society never get married. And so in some ways, this behavior is quite modern in terms of the social patterns. And it's very unusual for most pre-industrial societies, where most of the ones that we can observe, almost every woman gets married, right? And so what's unusual about Europe is this, as I say, this avoidance of marriage by substantial numbers of women. In terms of the illegitimacy, one of the important things in a country like Britain is that there are very strong social sanctions for illegitimate sex if it's not going to be a prelude to marriage. And the reason for that is that in a country like England, all the way from 1600 onwards, every parish was legally required to support every member within the parish. So you had this legal entitlement to support, even in the pre-industrial period. Children born outside marriage without a father were going to be a burden on the local taxes. And that meant that if any woman who was unmarried got pregnant, the local parish had a very strong incentive to find out who the father was and, if possible, make him marry the woman so that they would actually take on this tax burden. And also to discourage this, they would actually whip the parents in the public square in the harsher periods of this regime. And so there actually are these very strong sanctions against illegitimacy in this period. And it's actually, it's interesting that I'll talk to you a little bit about, I've done a lot of work looking at wills of men in England in this period, and there's very, very little sign of illegitimate births, right? So these are men leaving bequests to their children. Very, very rarely do they mention a son who was born outside wedlock or who has another mother. But later, as we go into the Industrial Revolution period, you can see that that breaks down quite dramatically, and men start living with women that they're not married to and leaving money to children that are clearly not from their current wife. But it is interesting in this early period that you have this tight regulation. And so one of the things that, as I say, used to be thought is that this somehow reflected a very different kind of rationality in Western Europe. That the reason people were doing this was that they didn't have a good mechanism to control fertility within marriage, and that they used abstinence as a way of avoiding fertility, and that this reflected a high degree of self-control by Europeans and a high desire for kind of individual determination, right? And that this really was a sign of a prelude to the Industrial Revolution, that this society had changed in important ways and was very different from other pre-industrial societies. It's a little, it does seem to be the result of, we'll see, of individual decisions. It's very hard to understand this, though, as an actual strategy of fertility control. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is, if you think about the marriage market, now economists tend to think of marriage in a very different way than romance novelists do. And so we typically frame marriage as being just another market within the society, right? That you bring certain attributes to this market, and that you're looking for the maximal return you can get and the best possible mate, right? And there's a lot about the way that people actually match up. If you look at the gross evidence that says this is not about love and romance, stuff like that. It's about what you bring to the marriage market and what the other party brings and what the best match that you can get within this market is. And so typically, for example, in our society, men and women still have attributes that are valued differently in this market. And women still typically marry men who are somewhat older, right? Because in men, age and earning power is valued more highly in the market. In women, youth and attractiveness is more highly valued. And so one of the things that we would think about this early market, if it really is the case that women are delaying getting married, simply because if you marry too early, you're going to have too many births. And so you have to wait till 28, because that way you can limit it to 5 births, and that's all that you want, right? Then what you would think is, well, when people match up in this market, older women will be relatively more attractive, right? They'll be better partners, right? And so that whereas in some societies you say a 16-year-old bride would be a very attractive partner, here you would say, hey, it's great, this person is 30, right? We're only going to have at maximum 4 or 5 children as a result of this marriage. If I marry a 16-year-old, I'll have 12 children and we're headed to poverty and decay and misery, right? It turns out that when men and women married in this period, women married men on average who were 2 years older, it's exactly the same as in the modern world. They're matching up in a very similar way. And there's a lot of variation, right? And so there's sometimes men marry older women. Sometimes they marry women who are much younger. But on average, the way people are matching up looks just like the modern world. And in cases where the age of marriage of women rises, it also rises for men. There's always roughly this 1.5-year or 2-year gap on average between the ages of men and the ages of women. And so it doesn't look like, but the point about men in this market is if they could find a 28-year-old bride, they don't have to wait. They don't have to abstain from sex for 10 years. They could actually get married younger, and they'd still limit the number of children that they would have. But the interesting thing is that they're delaying just as much as the women, right? And so it doesn't seem to be, in that sense, an attempt at conscious control. The second thing that makes it hard to believe that it's conscious control is that, I mean, this is just a form of abstinence. You can abstain after you get married, right? I mean, it is possible to actually have various forms of abstinence afterwards. We know in 19th century France, France was the first country in Europe where widespread fertility control developed. And that's why the relative size of France compared to England shrank dramatically in the course of the 19th century. Okay? And that also helps explain things like why English became the language of the entire world, because in 17th century Europe, there were many more French speakers than English speakers, but the French in the 18th century and 19th century started to have big declines in their fertility. They weren't exporting people in the same way that the incredibly fecund English were doing. And in places like North America then, when you had the struggle for control of North America, what you then find is that the English take over, and it actually has a big influence in terms of the kind of world that we end up in now. And so the French are the first where we actually see already by about 1780 that within marriage in France, they're starting to reduce the number of children that they're having. As far as we know, this is all through withdrawal and abstinence. There's no mechanical means of contraception that the French are using through most of the 19th century, even though then within marriage they're avoiding about half of all potential births within marriage by the end of the 19th century. And so again, as I say, if this was a strategy of conscious control, the puzzle is that it really, it's hard to see why they didn't do some kind of control within marriage. And there's no evidence of that in somewhere like England. A third thing that makes it difficult to believe that this really was conscious control is that we can get evidence now on marriage rates across rich and across poor people. And what you might think is, well, if I'm relatively rich, then I can afford to get married earlier, and if I'm relatively poor, I'm going to have to wait until later. Again, there's no sign of that, right? And in fact, the evidence for very rich men is that they actually tended to marry slightly younger brides, right? But they themselves are actually marrying just as late as poorer men, right? It's just not the case socially, for whatever reasons, that men would typically wait until 27 or 28 before they got married in this society. And so it really seems much more just like some kind of social convention, right? Like and the other reason that it may be that you have these kind of low frequency of marriage is that as people get older, they get crankier and less attractive to potential marriage partners, and just by the fact of everyone waiting, it may be that some people in the end just become relatively unattractive partners in this marriage market. We know a reasonable amount about how these markets actually work on the micro level because after the famine in Ireland in the mid-19th century, the Irish actually adopted one of the most extreme forms of this marriage market. And it was a pattern where men are not typically getting married till about 30 in Ireland, and women till the very late 20s. But again, within marriage, in part because of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church's rules, you have this completely unregulated fertility. And so a lot of my relatives are actually Irish, and Irish bachelors are famously eccentric and unmarriageable by the time they get into their 30s. And I know my own second cousin Owen was living in a house where he'd moved straw into the second bedroom on the farm, right? He'd had the cows in there with him if it was possible to get them in there conveniently. And you can see that after a certain while, no one is going to marry some of these people. And so another possibility is that the reason for the infrequent marriage is, as I say, that just as people get older, they get more eccentric, they get less marriageable, and it's just this custom of everyone delaying. And when you get extreme patterns in Ireland, a very late, long delay, then you get a lot of people who are just never going to end up married in this case. By the way, I should also mention that both of my parents came from families of 12 children. And the simple reason for that was that within that marriage pattern, both of my grandmothers married unusually young. They were both 16 when they got married. And so what happens then is you produce 12 or 13 births in the course of such a marriage. And with modern medicine in the early 20th century, you then get very high survival rates. And so you get these enormous family sizes. But it actually was very unusual for that kind of ethnic group, for that kind of marriage behavior. Okay? And so one of the puzzles, I say, in Europe is that it's very hard to make sense of this as a strategy of kind of individual control. Right? It just looks more like some kind of social custom. It's also been argued that this, well, it wasn't individual control. What this really reflected was a kind of social control. That the society as a whole knew that unregulated fertility was destructive to everyone, that it would drive down wages, it would drive up tax payments, and that they, as a whole, the society was really trying to keep clamps on people. One of the reasons that there's that feeling that it might have been some kind of social control of marriage is that it's quite characteristic in this pre-industrial society that after disasters, which kill a lot of people, such as outbreaks of the plague, what will happen immediately after is that the marriage rate will rocket upwards. That there's a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise have got married now suddenly get married, right? And so it seemed like there was a reserve army of the unmarried waiting in these societies with their suitcases packed, right, ready for a chance to get married. And so that in an epidemic like that, a large number of married people will lose their husband or their wife, and within 6 months or a year, a lot of those people are married again. A lot of people who were previously unmarried are now suddenly getting married within this society. And so that gave this impression that, well, there's a lot of people who would really like to get married, but somehow are being locked out. And it's been argued, for example, that in somewhere like pre-industrial England, the way that they could control marriage at the local level is by controlling the housing stock. There was, again, a very strong social custom within Western Europe that when you got married, you lived on your own. You don't live with your parents. And so you need your own house once you get married. This is not true in most other societies. In large numbers of societies, at least some of the children actually live with the parents after marriage, and it's just part of the social structure. In Europe, from at least the Middle Ages, in Western Europe, it really is this pattern. It's very modern that you live on your own and you have these nuclear families. And remember, you only have a small number of surviving children, so it's actually surprisingly modern, the social structure. How could they then control marriage at the local level in rural parishes? What they could simply do is not let people build any more houses. They would just control the housing stock. And so the argument was, what is happening then in these rural areas, the reason people are waiting till late period is that they have to wait until they've got enough income or enough assets or they inherit a house or something like that. And that's the reason that marriage is late. And it's also the reason why a lot of people are not getting married. And the second feature is that if people, in the inheritance customs in many of these communities, if they had land, it would actually be given just to one son. And again, the argument would be, well, why is the son waiting till later in order to get married? It's because you have to wait till your parents retire or die, right? And that typically, if men married late, the oldest surviving son will be born at ages of 30 to 35 for the father. The father will not be dead or retiring till they're age 60, and so that there's going to be this natural spacing whereby you're only going to inherit, and what's going to happen is as soon as you inherit the farm, then you get a bride, then you're an attractive marriage partner, then marriage occurs, and that there was actually some natural spacing going on within these societies. And so, again, it's been argued that maybe it wasn't individuals that were doing this. It was just these social mechanisms of control that were keeping people out of marriages. That we can actually discount. And the reason we can actually do that is that while it was true in rural areas that there were a lot of local controls on marriage, in the big cities, effectively in pre-industrial England, society had lost any way of controlling marriages. And so, for example, in London, it turns out that as an oddity of ecclesiastical law, any priest could marry anyone immediately in certain areas that surrounded each of the major prisons in London. And these were called the rules of the prison. So the Fleet prison had an area of housing around it that fell within its ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The reason that they had that is that a lot of people in this early society who were sent to prison are sent for bad debts. And so in pre-industrial England, if they had credit cards and you didn't pay up your credit card, the credit card company can actually put you in prison. They have to pay for your maintenance while you're in prison until you actually work off the debt. But the trouble is that people in prison can't carry on their trade in order to work off their debt. And so they would actually allow them to live within a few blocks of the prison. They couldn't stray from there until they'd actually paid off this debt. And it formed, for some reason, this peculiar ecclesiastical jurisdiction where in that area, anyone who was a cleric could actually perform a marriage. What happened then was these became equivalent to Las Vegas wedding chapels. They were quick, convenient, and easy ways to get married. The local pubs and inns would have clerics on retainer. You could turn up there in the morning, they'd get the cleric, they'd marry you, they'd feed you some feast, you could be all done with the matter and be finished. And so in somewhere like London, anyone essentially could get married to anyone, right? And there's lots of jokes about these fleet marriages and about, sailors being kind of beguiled and suddenly finding themselves married to someone after they got pretty drunk in this area of town. But it did mean that and also people living near London, if they wanted to get married, you could just come into the city, go there, and instantly get married. And it's relatively cheap. So if we think if it was all social control, what would actually happen is that in the big cities, marriage would be early and would be often because these controls would disappear. Instead, people in London also marry late, and there's a high rate of non-marriage within London as well. And so we can discount that this is actually effectively some kind of social control because even without controls, Europeans are engaging in this pattern of marriage. And so it is some kind of individual, deliberate, conscious choice, but a choice that is hard to rationalize in terms of the thing that they were really concentrating on was fertility. It just seems to be some other element of social structure where the way they looked at marriage was such that a lot of people just looked at the possibilities, a lot of women in England in the pre-industrial period looked at the stock of English men, looked at the possibilities marriage would offer them, and said, I'd rather die celibate and childless. It's just a society where people made a very different set of choices. And so that's why we think fertility is limited in Europe. And as I say, it doesn't reflect any kind of advanced ability of people to control their lives. It's just some kind of way of thinking that they had about the possibilities. So that's what's happening in Europe. What about East Asia? As I say, until very recently, erase this first. Until very recently, it was thought that fertility rates must be very high in Asia, and that was going to explain the very, very low living standards of Asia. And the reason it was thought that is that in East Asia, marriage for women is essentially universal. 99% of all women get married within this society. One of the things that helps almost all these women get married is that there's large-scale female infanticide. So there's a desperate shortage of women within these societies, right? And similarly, in modern America, if you're a woman and you really want to maximize your chances of getting married, then you need to go to places like Alaska, where there's an equivalent shortage of women. and avoid certain other parts of the country where there's a large surplus of women. And it does affect people's chances of getting married, right? And as I say, that's why economists think of this as it's not just love, it's a market, right? And in the Alaskan market, women have very high probabilities of getting married because of the absolute shortage of women in frontier conditions. And so in East Asia, the advantage that women had was that female infanticide meant that for every 100 men, there were only something like 70 or 80 available women. And by the way, China is reproducing these conditions of the pre-industrial period at this moment, because the one-child policy combined with selective abortions actually means that China is developing in current generations a very large surplus of men. And similarly, India, again, with the possibilities of selective abortions, is also developing substantial surpluses of men. And actually, what this means for women in this generation in China is that in terms of the marriage market, it's going to be very good odds. But the Chinese government apparently is worried about the problems of social control if you really have, we're talking 20, 30 million men in each generation who will not be able to get married within these societies. And so women marry almost universally. They also marry very young in Asia. And so in Japan and in China, we know that the average woman is married by age 19 as opposed to 25 or 26. And so that is going to add per woman in the society 2 or 3 births at European standards of birth rates. And as I say, the fact that 100% as opposed to 80% or 85% are getting married is also going to add as another group of births, right? And so if fertility within marriage was the same in Asia as it was in Europe, then the conclusion was going to be that Asia would have these much higher birth rates, it would have lower life expectancies, it would have lower living conditions, and this was going to explain this difference in the pre-industrial world between Europe and Asia. Since then, however, much more careful demographic work has been done on what's actually happening within marriages in Asia. And so in Japan, what they're able to use are birth records at Buddhist temples that have been preserved well back into the 18th century. In China, there are clan lineages, that some of which extend back 700 years, where they record all of the births and events for each of these clan groupings. And unfortunately, as I say, because of infanticide and because women have relatively low status, the women tend to disappear from these records. But we know that there'll be more male births than female births under natural conditions, and so we can just concentrate on the male births and actually calculate, well, what is the actual birth rate within these societies. And so let me give you again, here's the Hutterite rate, and then here's the rate for China at each age of marriage. So there's 20 to 24, 25 to 9, 30 to 34, 35 to 9, and 40 to 44. And as I say, this is kind of the maximum that's possible with healthy conditions and unrestricted fertility. What happened within Chinese marriages? What's actually happening is birth rates are very low within marriage in Asia. And again, all the way through, at each age range, these birth rates are low. And as I say, they're uniformly about half the Hutterite level. Okay? And they similarly decay with age, they decline with age, so that women in China, by the time they get to their 40s, are giving birth to 1 child every 10 years. Right? And that's about half the Hutterite level. And so if a Hutterite woman is married at 20 and lives till 45, she would have 10.6 births on average. If a woman in pre-industrial China was married at 20 and lived to age 45, she'd give birth to 5 children. So what's actually happening in China, and remember, in China, almost every woman gets married, And so 5 is roughly the total fertility rate for China. What was the total fertility rate on average in Europe? It's 5. It turns out that China and Europe actually had equivalent birth rates in the pre-industrial period, right? There's no difference in terms of the actual birth rates between Asia and Europe, but it's controlled by these completely different mechanisms in China. And one of the questions this raises is, well, is it the Chinese who are actually the society where people are practicing conscious fertility control, where the Europeans have fertility that's limited just by some kind of social custom? Because this looks much more like conscious control in the sense that the spacing of births is greater. And the one thing we do know about China is that infanticide of girls is by very deliberate mechanisms, right? The reason we know that is the chances of a girl living in a family in China are strongly influenced by how, if it's the first child that's born and it's a girl, the girl has much better chances of surviving than if it's the 5th child that's born, right? So the first girl is not such a big problem, right? It depends on if there's a lot of girls who have been born within the family, the chances of a girl actually surviving decline, okay? And so that what you can actually see is that the infanticide is actually effectively a deliberate form of birth control within pre-industrial China. Question? So the question that come up here is it also because there are multiple wives are possible in pre-industrial China, right? I'll actually come back and talk about that because it's a big difference. In Europe, the rule is one husband, one wife, right? In China, through most of the pre-industrial period, richer men will often have multiple wives, okay? But here we're just concentrating on the fertility level of the women. So and we'll talk about this later, it turns out that if a man has multiple wives, their fertility rates individually will be lower than if a man has single wives, right? And so there is some effect in terms of having multiple wives reduces the fertility of the individual wives. But even if you took cases where it's just one man, one wife, you would find that fertility in China was substantially below the natural level, right? And so that there really is this difference within Chinese marriage, okay? But the interesting thing is that I don't think that they have found clear evidence of targeting in terms of actual births. They find it in terms of infanticide in China, but in terms of births, what you would expect in terms of targeting is that, look, initially people would get married and would have relatively high fertility rates. Then once they've achieved the desired family size, then fertility would actually decline very sharply. Okay? But this is not the case. It's just that at any age level, fertility is lower within these marriages. Okay? And similarly, I believe it's the case that they have not found that, well, if I have a lot of surviving children, then my fertility is going to drop sharply. Or if I have a lot of surviving sons, then my fertility will actually decline precipitously. And so the thing is that I don't think there's any clear understanding about why in both China and Japan in the pre-industrial period, women simply give birth to relatively few children, right? But one of the interesting things is that it also suggests that would have been possible in Europe, right? That there isn't any particular technology that Chinese or Japanese have. I mean, one possible issue is that it's just a health issue, that nutrition levels are so low that women's chances of conceiving are actually relatively poor within China. But in that case, what we would expect then is if we went to rich families, we would actually find much higher fertility levels here, right? If that's going to explain the difference between here and Hutterite levels. And again, I don't think there's good evidence of that. I think it's just uniformly the case in China between rich and poor. We'll see that there just are not a lot of births within marriage in both China and Japan in the pre-industrial period. And so again, the interesting thing is they're controlling fertility, but we don't find a lot of evidence that it's actually some kind of conscious control within the society. It's something to do with the customs of marriage. And as I say, that's one of the things I emphasized before is there's a lot of historical mysteries because things that would be obvious to people at the time are just not recorded. And so I don't think there are any sources in China that actually discuss, in pre-industrial China, that say, well, why did marriage end up this way, right? Why did it result in this particular pattern of births? And so that all you're left, in some sense, is with the evidence of the spacing of births here, right? And as I say, this is based purely on male births that this calculation is being done, right? Because of the fact that a lot of the female births are going to disappear, but we can correctly inflate to estimate pretty well what the totals are going to be. So that's the Chinese pattern. One of the other things I should say is that in terms of infanticide, it's also the case that they find more missing girls in periods when grain prices rise, and so that living standards decline. And so that if a girl is born in a bad year, in a year where people are suffering hunger, then their relative chance of survival compared to boys will actually decline quite substantially, right? And so we actually know in Asia that in some sense they were much more willing to consciously control populations, certainly after birth, right? But it's unclear what was actually happening within marriages in terms of controlling fertility, if this really was some kind of conscious strategy of control. So that's the settled agrarian societies. What about the original foragers? What was their fertility likely like? Now, when we look again at the foragers, we can't get any evidence except for modern groups. It used to be thought by archaeologists that they could look at the pelvises of women in the pre-industrial world and actually figure out from the kind of markings on the pelvises how many births they'd had. That turned out to be complete pseudoscience and to have absolutely no foundation, right? And it's interesting that for a while they were actually doing this, but it turns out it actually had absolutely no basis in fact, right? And I guess the idea was that the kid actually coming out would actually leave these marks on your bones that you could then trace. But it turns out birth is not that bad, right? And you can't actually find the skeletal evidence. So what we have to actually do then is go to kind of modern forager bands. And, they have problems there because these are typically small groups of people. The anthropologists are only with them for relatively short periods of time. And so it's quite difficult to actually get accurate measures. And so there's going to be a lot of variation across the various groups. But with enough information, if we take the median, we can actually find what that's going to be. And the important thing is that if we take the total fertility rate in Northwest Europe, the answer is it's about 5. In East Asia, it's something like 4.9. What's the median for foragers? It's 4.5. If anything, they have lower fertility rates than settled agrarian societies. And how do they end up with these lower fertility rates? Well, it turns out that the equivalent of marriage in these societies is very much on the kind of East Asian model. Women start sexual activity very young. Almost all women are engaged in sexual activity, are married. But there's this much longer birth spacing within the society. And often also there's relatively early stopping of fertility within this society. And what actually happens here is that a lot of these groups have strong customs about sexual activity after birth that ensure that there's a substantial spacing between the birth of the first child and the birth of later children. So in some of these groups, there may be a complete cessation of sexual activity for 2 or 3 years after birth. It's just taboo within this society. And what we think is that it's the nature of life that you have to move all the time. You can only carry at maximum 1 child, right? And so consequently, you just isn't space in these societies for births occurring at more than a certain frequency. And the chances of children surviving will just drop dramatically if they're falling within that interval. And the societies have consciously developed these customs that try and space out births within the societies. And so it really does confirm this idea that it's not going to be the case that the arrival of settled agrarian societies is going to do anything in terms of improving human living conditions through fertility. If anything, it was going to make things worse, right? And it's also, interestingly, the case that none of these pre-industrial societies, or typically very few of them, have natural birth rates in the sense of moving to these total fertility rates that are the equivalent of 9 or 10 per woman that are possible under pre-industrial conditions. We do find a few instances where birth rates really rocket upwards. And interestingly, those tend to be frontier societies. They tend to be societies where there's essentially free land available. So remember, the French in France had this total fertility rate of kind of close to 5. When the French moved to Quebec and settled there, they ended up with much higher fertility rates and much higher, very rapid population growth rates within Quebec. If you go to Eastern Europe and Russia, what you find is women marry young, they marry universally, they have lots of children within marriage, and you get very rapid population growth rates. But it's interesting, it tends to be in societies where there's abundance of land, and it seems to be that there's some kind of self-regulator within these societies such that once you've filled up the available space, somehow social customs are adapting so that birth rates actually drop within these societies, but not seemingly through kind of conscious, deliberate activity most of the time. Okay? So that's what we know about births. The last thing we want to look at is, well, in the Malthusian model, one of the big questions that comes up if we draw a graph of birth rates and income is, what does that curve look like? Okay? Because remember, one of the debates is going to be, does this model really apply? And if it does apply, it either has to be that there's a very strong positive effect of income on births, or else that there's a very strong negative effect of income on deaths, right? It's got to be, you've got these two curves that cross. If it turns out, for example, and some people would claim about this, about pre-industrial Europe, that basically there's a birth rate that looks like this, and there's a death rate that looks like this, then you're not going to ever get a Malthusian equilibrium. Societies will either keep on growing in terms of population, or they'll keep on declining in terms of population. But you're not actually going to have this kind of homeostasis and this always being forced back to the equilibrium. And so that's why there's been a lot of interest about trying to actually measure what these curves look like. Okay? And one of the ways we can do that for Western Europe, for both England and France, we have complete birth rate records that have been reconstructed all the way back to 1540. So we know for every year in those societies, well, here's what birth rates were. And we could also measure income in somewhere like England. And one temptation would be, well, let's just plot it on this picture and see what that looks like. And the answer, if you do that, is that by, say, 10-year periods of income versus fertility, well, income varies a reasonable amount, and fertility rates vary a reasonable amount, and it looks like this. And actually, it looks just flat. Right? It doesn't look like there's any positive effect of income on fertility. But that's not a very good test, because in this world, there may be some birth rate schedule. I mean, and it would be quite possible, for example, to have birth rates that look like this, but that schedule could actually be moving around from period to period. There could be other things that are actually moving that relationship from period to period, such as disease environment, social customs, various other things, so that you could actually have this slope but not observe it, because that curve could potentially be moving up and down, right? And that you're not actually observing what the true slope is, right, at any time within the society because of that movement of the curve itself. And so, but as I say, the aggregate evidence actually in Europe, at this level, there's no evidence. Another thing you could actually look at is at annual fluctuations in births and deaths, because, an interesting thing is we are living in a world of fear and anxiety at present. You should be living in a world of fear and anxiety. You may have noticed that the economy is in crisis, and that people are losing their houses and losing their jobs. In actual practice, the output of the American economy has dropped by probably less than 4%. In the pre-industrial world, because of the importance of weather on harvests, the output in that society would jump by 10, 20% from year to year, right? They were actually subjected annually to much greater shocks to output. What's actually interesting about our society is that quite small shocks to output can produce kind of very alarming distress within the society because it tends to get concentrated on a few specific individuals. Pre-industrial society, actually, these were people who were used to dramatic changes in their living standards just going from one year to the next as a result of harvest failures. So, for example, in England, we have the complete record of grain prices from 1200 to 1450. The highest price would be 6 times what the lowest price was, and the wage doesn't change from year to year as those prices are changing. So you could find yourself in 1 year 6 times better off than you were in the next year within that society. And so these were people who were really subjected to enormous shocks to their real income levels. One of the temptations then is to say, well, what happened? And we don't observe in the medieval period birth rates, but after 1540, when we can observe these birth rates, we observe these annual fluctuations in real income, we can ask, well, is there any response? And the answer for England and also for France is there's very, very little sign of response. That those kind of level of income shocks, it doesn't seem to do much to marriage rates, to death rates later, or to birth rates in the society. And so that, again, is a reason why some people have said, look, the Malthusian model, it just doesn't apply to societies like pre-industrial Europe, because if it's going to apply, we want to know, well, what is that relation? We want to see some relationship between either death rates or birth rates and income, right, in order for us to say that that model is really applying. And so the second way, though, that we could possibly look at this is that in any of these societies, if we look at people in cross-section, we find enormous disparities in wealth. In fact, I'll show you later, these are much more unequal, these societies, than the modern world. One of the surprising results of the Industrial Revolution was actually to greatly equalize incomes in modern societies compared to societies like pre-industrial England. Okay? And one of the surprising, again, results of the Industrial Revolution was the major beneficiary of the Industrial Revolution has been unskilled labor. Because we think of that as machines replacing people. But it turns out that the biggest beneficiaries of things like the Industrial Revolution were actually unskilled workers. The biggest losers from the Industrial Revolution were the traditional landed classes of the pre-industrial world who owned most of the wealth in the pre-industrial world. Their wealth disappeared because we'll see that land became a relatively unimportant asset after the Industrial Revolution from being the major asset in the pre-industrial society. So this is a very unequal society. So a second possibility is, well, can we look across families and across individuals and see then, is there any effect of income on fertility? Okay? And how can we measure at the individual level what's going to happen here? Well, it turns out we need to combine evidence from 2 separate sources. The first of these sources are wills. All the way through till something like 1450 or 1500 in England, it's quite common in the society for men at death to actually leave a will. And the interesting thing is that this is a world where, in the early period, a lot of people seem to know that they're close to the end. When you get a certain type of sickness, people seem to know that's a bad one, right? And so a lot of these wills were actually made within a couple of days or weeks of the death of the person, right? And it's actually, in some sense, it's a very peaceable society. Most people die in their beds, and a lot of people have time to actually make a will. And that, from those wills, we can actually infer how rich these people were at the time of their death. Okay? And so that gives us a nice measures of rich people. And it tends to be just the richer people within the society that make wills, but a lot of people who actually have very, very little in the way of assets, a cow, some metal plates, stuff like that, they actually leave wills as well. Right? And we also learn a lot about the society from these wills because we see how people treat their children and how they treat their wives in terms of these wills. And so one of the interesting things that emerges in these wills is that Europeans seem to have relatively high regard for women compared to a lot of pre-industrial societies. Women inherit quite a lot of the wealth right? They don't inherit as much as boys, but they actually do get a fairly substantial share of the income of the parents. Even if they're single and unmarried, they actually get to inherit. The interesting thing about men's attitude to their wives that shows up in these wills is that men are very distrustful of their wives in this society. And what happens is if the men die and the wife is young and still capable of having children, their big fear is that their money will be taken by the wife and used to have other children, right? And so that often they will, in the early period, sometimes they'll even include a stipulation, my wife cannot remarry. Or more likely they'll say, if she remarries, all of the money goes to the children immediately, right? Legally they can't do that. Legally the wife is supposed to get a third of all the assets. But as I say, these wills are nice in the sense that they give us, for a class of these people, a good measure of income and wealth across a really wide range of incomes. How do we measure their fertility? That's going to have to wait till Monday. Anyway, have a great weekend, and make sure we'll be, for the exam, we'll be doing just up to the end of Chapter 4. So by Monday, the beginning of class on Monday, we'll have finished everything in terms of the exam later next week. Thank you.